Thank you. It is lovely to be here today with all of you. So in April of 2019, the Israeli moonlander Beresheet earned the dubious distinction of being the first vessel to crash on the moon since 1971. It was a short-lived distinction. India's Vikram lander also crashed into the moon in September of that year. 2019 was a bad year for human-made objects crashing into the moon. Thankfully, these were vessels without human crews. In the case of the Beresheet lander, however, it was not a vessel without life. The Beresheet moonlander was carrying in its cargo thousands of tardigrades, tiny living organisms also known as water bears. And these thousands of tardigrades are now quite possibly scattered across the surface of the moon. Now, the moon is not a friendly environment. If I told you that a few thousand baby ducks were accidentally scattered across the surface of the moon, that would be a very upsetting story. But here's the amazing thing about this story. It is not impossible that those tardigrades are still very much alive up there in their new home on the moon. Well, what are tardigrades? Tardigrades are very tiny organisms or microanimals around a half a millimeter long, probably related to crustaceans or insects, although they are not either of those things. They're an ancient life form. Scientists estimate tardigrades have been on Earth for about 600 million years. By comparison, we Homo sapiens have been around for maybe 300,000 years, if we're being generous. Tardigrades are a diverse and widespread category of life. There are over 1,000 different species of tardigrade, which make up their own phylum, Tardigrada. They are found on every continent on Earth, under every possible living condition. Wikipedia says, and I believe them, that there are tardigrades in rainforests, in the Antarctic, on mountaintops, and in deep sea volcanoes. The last species of tardigrade to be discovered was found in a parking lot in Japan, clinging to a bit of moss. They like to live on moss, which is why they are also sometimes called moss piglets. And tardigrades do sort of look like piglets or bears if you like squint and stretch your imagination. They have blobby barrel-shaped bodies composed of 4 segments, each segment with 2 stubby legs for a grand total of 8 stubby legs, each leg ending in 4 to 8 claws. They have a ring-shaped mouth as the only opening in their head, armed with tough little spiky things for extracting nutrients from tiny plants or occasionally from other smaller tardigrades. Tardigrades look a bit like an oblong beanbag with a mouth and 8 little clawed legs, or maybe a teeny tiny loaf of French bread with a mouth and 8 little clawed legs. They're actually pretty cute. Now there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that the great naturalist J.B.S. Haldane was once asked by a theologian what he could deduce about the mind of the Creator from his studies of nature. And Haldane replied that God appeared to be inordinately fond of beetles. And this joke came from the observation that there are more species of beetle than any other living thing, some 350,000 species of beetles. In fact, beetles make up about 22% of all species of living things. So if you randomly picked a species to be your new best friend from the smorgasbord of life, there's more than a 1 in 5 chance you are going to befriend a beetle. Well, in a similar fashion, we could say that God must be inordinately fond of tardigrades, because God seems very deeply committed to keeping them around come what may. The most amazing thing about tardigrades is their sheer indestructibility. A tardigrade has a trick where it expels all the water from its body and curls up into a small hard ball, ceasing all metabolic activity. This is called its tun state, T-U-N, tun state. And a tardigrade in this state can survive conditions that would kill almost any other organism. You can freeze a tardigrade to a temperature barely above absolute 0. It will thaw and go on about its business. You can bake them at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, no problem. They can survive pressure 6 times greater than the deepest ocean trenches. You can blast them with cosmic radiation 100 times greater than what would kill a human, and they are fine. They can survive in a vacuum for 8 days. Tardigrades in ton state have been documented to survive without food or water for up to 30 years, then get revived with little water and go on about their merry way. They have survived all 5 of the Earth's mass extinctions, so odds are pretty good they will survive the 6th, the one biologists say that we are currently living through. And now there are tardigrades on the moon. Will they survive there? They might, if they can keep away from UV radiation. UV radiation turns out to be tardigrade kryptonite. But if they landed in a spot on the moon shielded from UV radiation, the bare sheet tardigrades might stand a chance of survival. This is according to Mark Martin, an associate professor of biology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, quoted on the website livescience.com. He said, "My guess is if we went up in the next year or so, recovered the wreckage and found those tiny little tons, put them in water, some of them would come back to life." So when I think about those hardy little moss piglets orbiting now overhead, first I have to give them mad respect. What a wondrous piece of work is the tardigrade. And then my imagination goes to some future lunar visitor, some far distant extraterrestrial wanderer, and what they might now find there. Well, they would find various wrecked Earth vehicles, some astronaut footprints to ponder over, the fossils of bacteria trapped in discarded bags of astronaut poop. And yes, there's astronaut poop on the moon. And now they will find tardigrades. And who is to say which discovery will elicit greater wonder? We humans like to think of ourselves as the apex species, as the crowning achievement of life on Earth. Before the theory of evolution, the fundamental story to explain the appearance and diversity of life on Earth, at least in the West, was the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Christian Old Testament. The book of Genesis says that the universe, the earth, all life was created over the course of 6 days by God. And then to cap off this project, at the end of 6 days, God made humans as a special act of creation, as the only object of creation made in the image of God. Then God put us in charge of everything that came before. And in the story, we humans are granted dominion over the earth and all its living things. And in that word dominion lies the capacity for some very big, long-term theological, spiritual, and cultural problems. Now, I'm not intending to critique Judaism here or put it into a box, right? There are ways of reading this creation myth that understand God to be calling humans to live in harmony with creation as its servant and protector. The Jewish concept of tikkun olam calls the faithful to be healers of the world. But an unsophisticated idea of dominion, I suggest, warps the relationship of humanity to other living things, replacing a relationship of mutuality and interdependence with a relationship of domination and exploitation. And it is an unsophisticated idea of dominion that still informs our Western way of thinking and our Western way of life. The story of special creation and dominion was, after all, the story of life in the West for most of its history. And then along comes the theory of evolution, and it takes the idea of the special creation of human life, that human life is radically different from all other kinds of living beings, and it replaces this idea with the idea that all life, including human life, is the product of one continuous unfolding process set in motion ultimately by the birth of the universe. Evolution replaces the 6 days of the book of Genesis with 14 billion years, give or take. 12 billion years from the Big Bang to make a Milky Way galaxy and to shape and cool and properly water a nutrient-rich planet Earth. An unknown amount of time for some of those nutrients to spontaneously organize into replicating molecule chains, and 2 billion years, give or take, for those replicating molecule chains to organize into living cells, and then for those living cells to diversify into all the life we see around us. Now, Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, surmised, and science tends to confirm his view, that all living things alive today are the common descendants of one ancestral organism. Everything alive today, the common descendant of one organism. And from this single root grew the tangled tree of life. As species branched off and branched off and branched off from their forebears, each finding their own unique way to make a successful living in the ecosystem. So popular depictions of evolution often greatly simplify this process to show a linear march of life forms through time, right? With the fish crawling out of the water, evolving into the reptile, then the mammal, then primates and humans. You've seen the poster. The arrangement visually suggests a process of replacement of one thing turning into another, newer, better thing. It reads like a story of progress, where humans are at the end of progress. And in this way, the emotional content of the old dominion idea of humanity's specialness is preserved within the new framework of evolution. We think naturally in terms of lower and higher life forms, and we place ourselves at the top of this ladder of being. And so the question is sometimes asked, thinking of life as a progression from worse to better, that if monkeys evolved into humans, why are monkeys still around? If the lower forms evolved into the higher life forms, then why weren't the lower life forms replaced? But this is a misunderstanding of evolution, because monkeys did not evolve into humans. Rather, monkeys and humans share a common ancestor, which means at some point there was a species that was not a monkey and not a human. And some of its ancestors settled on the monkey way of being in the world, which is awesome. And some of its ancestors settled on the human way of being in the world, which is equally awesome. And so evolution is not a linear progression. It is a branch giving rise to more branches, which give rise to more branches, which give rise to more branches. And our human species then is like one tiny green shoot on one of millions of branches of the tree of life, each having come into existence in exactly the same way, each sharing the common trait of having found an awesome way of being in the world. And how absurd then to circle our one tiny shoot on this enormous bristling plant of healthy, successful growths and say, well, this is clearly the reason this plant exists, this tiny little shoot. And all of the whole exists to service this one little shoot. Evolution has been called a second Copernican revolution. The first Copernican revolution said the Earth, and thus humankind, is not at the center of the universe, but lies in one corner of a spiraling galaxy amidst billions of galaxies. Evolution, the second Copernican revolution, says humankind is not at the center of the biosphere either. We are not a special act of creation made by God as the last act of the sixth day and given dominion over the earth. We are not above other living things. And in this way, evolution proposes a radical decentering of the human story in the overall story of life on Earth. We are one species among millions, all created by the same unthinking process, neither more nor less likely, neither more nor less chosen, neither more nor less destined to a bright future. Evolution tells us, in the words of UU Minister Forrest Church, that we all come from a common source and we share a common destiny. And what a common source it is. Born of ancient stars whose matter traversed billions of miles of space to shape our galaxy, our world, and ultimately become our very flesh and blood. We have stardust in our bones and stardust in our veins, and our story is as old as the universe and inseparable from the universe. What mystery and magic and dignity there is in this story of life. Now, you can certainly believe in evolution and still believe in a creator God. Some 30% of Americans who believe in evolution also believe the process was set in motion or is somehow inspired or guided by a divine being. It's important to understand that, scientifically speaking, the theory of evolution does not require a helper God to work. The theory says that random, undirected mutations plus natural selection plus lots and lots of time is sufficient to explain the life that we see. But evolution is not incompatible with a helper God. What I would say is, if you believe that evolution is the means by which God created life, then I would urge you to consider the story of evolution as if it were itself an alternative creation text, an alternative creation text. And then what is the meaning of that story? Why did God choose this process over all others, which emphasizes not our specialness, but our kinship, our interconnectedness, our interdependence with all other living things. What message do we read in this scientific text about the intentions of our Creator, if Creator we have? The dominion mythos, I believe, has been a ticking time bomb within our culture. So long as humans were limited in their capacity to materially affect their environment, this worldview might condone the local exploitation of animals and the local despoliation of the environment, but it could not break out to do global harm. But for the last several centuries, our astonishing increase in technological prowess has been harnessed to the engine of global capitalism to exert our dominion over the natural world to an unprecedented degree. And too late, we are discovering, as climate change and species extinction spiral out of control, that our pretense at dominion is an illusion, that we remain in the end utterly dependent on natural systems vastly greater than our ability to predict and control. And so we need a creation story that emphasizes our kinship with the web of life. We need a creation story that restores the dignity of the natural world and all of its living inhabitants. We need a creation story that brings us back into oneness with the processes that nurture and sustain us. And we need a creation story that reconnects us to the enchantment and the awesomeness of the natural world. In our reading today, Reverend Kathleen McTeague wrote about learning to think in geologic time, with a frame of reference that decenters the human story and places us in the framework of this larger creation story. She says, we might learn not only to think like a stone, but also to think like an American chestnut or an elm, to think like a peeper or a cicada, a hawk or a red fox, a vulture, a coral reef, or an Amazon butterfly. We might come to believe that their lives on Earth matter as much as our own. To Charles Darwin, we owe the discovery that written into each creature, howsoever humble, is the history of the universe. You, me, the squirrels chasing each other on the lawn, the beetles churning the soil underneath, the birds serenading us above, the tiny tardigrades clinging to the moss, or even now on the surface of the moon. We are all part of the same ancient story of life unfolding since before even the stars lit the skies. And within us and through us all moves the same creative force, bringing endless new forms of life into being. We are in deep kinship with the life teeming all around. So let this be the beginning of a new creation story, not a story of separation and domination, but a story of connection and care. Let us recognize before it is too late, and it is almost too late, our deep interdependence with the web of existence. Let us act before it is too late to protect and preserve this earth, our home. Let us learn before it is too late to live from a place of gratitude, reverence, and familial affection for all living things, our kin. If we can tell a new story, we can imagine a new way. May this new story we tell be a story of renewal, a story of hope, and a story of healing for our world that so needs healing. Blessed be, and amen.